Greetings, everyone. We're moving on here, looking at more images, talking more about these photographs. I see many of you have started and posting photographs on Flickr. And so you're already in this process, but I want to continue looking at photographs. And the one thing I want to look at with this and start thinking about really is the idea of presidential campaigns and photography, visual culture, how all this stuff affects us. And I think this is a really good thing to look at and think about because certainly can dramatically affect our democracy if we buy in at all that images can affect our culture and our country. So I call this presidential photographs, campaigns, publicity, and otherwise, or other not so wise. Now, as you go through your photographs, I imagine that you'll take some, you'll change them, keep looking at, keep exploring, keep trying new things with this. Don't just ever get satisfied with any one image. And I think that's the key, to successful just about anything is to keep trying and never be satisfied with anything. Good enough is never good enough. There's always another way, chance, or direction to go. Also, I think an interesting story here as I started looking for these presidential photographs, interesting ones to show you and talk about and think, get you thinking about how to construct an image and what an image can say and all that sort of stuff. I started, thinking about, well, when was the first photograph? And the earliest one I found was 1841, William Henry Harrison, which I would buy, I think was probably a fair assessment as the earliest photograph of a sitting president, because photography, as we talked about the other day, birth was 1839. Though this story is a little warning to the wise, because I found a couple other sites that said that different photographs were the photographs of the first president. This was one of them, image 1848 image of John Quincy Adams, and this certainly, John Quincy Adams was a president. However, he was a president in 1824, not 48, so he's certainly not a sitting president here at this time. And as we see, we found the 1841 image of William Henry Harrison. Now, also with this image, the interesting thing is the site I found it on says this is an 1850 copy of an 1841 daguerreotype. So, different visual permutations. And I think these things are all really important. How we're using photographs and how photographs of photographs and copies of photographs and what's an original and what was first, and sometimes I think that's not really that important, but other times I think it really does affect us. So the 1848 image of John Quincy Adams, the sitting president at that time was 1849 James K. Polk. This was another image that someone said was the first photograph of a sitting president or president. Obviously, it seems that's not true. I don't know exactly, who was the first, but that's probably something I'll continue to look for. See if I can find that information. All right, this one, it looks like a tintype. So that was a little newer process than the daguerreotypes. The previous images were all daguerreotypes, the first photographic process. Anyways, I think what becomes interesting with photography and where it really has a chance to affect it is in the campaign and how they're used in campaigns. I'm not positive here if Lincoln was the first one to use a photograph in a campaign. He's the first one I've come across to see photographs from a campaign. Here is a button, very common political tool to get your name and ideas out there is the political button. And they've been around and probably, I don't know if they're in use as much. They probably still exist, but these were used. Obviously here we're looking at 1860 presidential campaign, all the way up until current times. I mean 1980s, 90s. Political button still very popular. So this is a very small tintype. It's referred to what is a little gem. They would take 16 images on one plate, and then they would cut up the plate. So you can mass produce these to some degree. Tintypes were one-of-a-kind photographs. As were daguerreotypes were also one-of-a-kind photographs. But also we do have reproducible photographs at this time. The calotype, which was developed by Henry Fox Talbot in England, was a negative process where you could make multiples from one negative. But most of the popular processes at this time were the one-of-kind tintypes, daguerreotypes. Though we also get albumin prints, which are a negative and can be reproduced, etc., etc., etc. Anyways, here's a campaign photo button from Lincoln. And the other side had his Hannibal, his vice presidential candidate he was running with. Here's an image from the Civil War. This is not a tintype. This would probably be not an ambrotype, but albumin print. We also, I came across another website searching for all this stuff where they're talking about politics and photo montage, manipulation. This is Lincoln's body on a different president's, or Lincoln's head on a different president's body. So the photograph on the right is the unaltered image. The one on the left is a photo montage. Thinking about portraiture, thinking about, we're talking about lighting, talking about expression, talking about all these things as we look at your basic head and shoulder, portrait. Here's the one of Teddy Roosevelt. Look at the light, look at the contrast, look at the dark, look at the look that he's giving. What is he projecting there? That when you come to that head and shoulder thing, so much of it is about that look. What do your face say? What does your face say? What do your eyes say? You want to sneer? Do you want to smile? Do you want to confront? That's what that image is all about. There's an interesting image of Roosevelt. Here is, he was Robert M. La Follette, not ever elected to the president. He was a 1924 progressive presidential candidate. He was a senator. He was a Wisconsin governor. He was all sorts of things. But he was a very strong reformer. So he is photographed here on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and this was purely staged. This image was made for his campaign, and this, from my understanding, was very typical of La Follette, this pounding of the fists. He was apparently a very good orator and a populist, progressive, a man of the people, and trying to communicate those ideas. So this context, this environment, this is what you're going to have to do one of these days. What is that environment that you photograph yourself in, and what is that saying? What is that context, as well as your actions and the lighting and all those things? What do they communicate to the viewer? Here's Harry Truman. This is just not something you might think of with Truman, but here he is with Lauren Bacall, playing the piano for Lauren Bacall and giving a very nice look and gaze at her as she sits up on his piano. So a little different insight to the man who dropped the bomb. There's just so many images we could be looking at, but so we're trying to look at one of the more interesting ones. I am going to try and get a video posted for you that deals with presidential photography, and they do talk about Kennedy in that film. They call him Jack the Back. He said he would often turn his back to the camera because he projected a certain image that he wanted, and they found it very effective. So here he is with Eisenhower discussing, of course. Here he is with his brother. I think this is during the campaign. So, discussing strategy or whatever. So, the dark and the light and the contrast and their looks and their leaning together and all these things that it communicates, can be pretty interesting. Here's his opposition. The Kennedy-Nixon really, in many ways, changes political campaigns. That campaign changes presidential campaigns in this country because it was the first televised debate on there. And the interesting story, I think I'll have you look a little blurb on this too, but the story is that those who listened to the radio felt Nixon won the debate, and those who watched television felt Kennedy won the debate because Kennedy looked cooler, more calm, and Nixon, for health reasons, I believe, was, and whatever reasons, was up there sweating and just looked kind of nervous and whatnot. And so this interesting dialogue about how visuals do and can affect us and our opinions and our thoughts. We are not objective people. We are subjective beings, and these images can have an effect on us. Of course, here he is with the king, Elvis. Here's another image from Nixon. He had a bowling lane put in the White House. I guess he was a big bowler. I love the wallpaper, and he matches the wallpaper too. And then, of course, his exit from the presidency, not so graceful. And we have a couple different photographs here. You know, when you're doing these images, you can manipulate them. You know, you can make them color or black and white or whatever you want to do with them. Here we have a color image. This is, I believe this is after he's resigned his presidency, and he turns around and gives this big, and then this is a very typical Nixon gesture, and gives this big, you know, big grin and gesture here, V for victory. We also have another photograph from this event, slightly different angle, closer up, and black and white. So, you know, it can change the image. Even the cropping here, you know, this one we get more environment, we get more space, we get more context. This one's just much more zeroed in on him. So it can change how we think about the photograph. I've got a couple from Lyndon B. Johnson. And they're both with dogs, so I'm not sure if he's a great lover of dogs. But, you know, they show a very human side of him, you know, and as you're trying to construct an identity, you know, you want to show a lot of different sides. You want to, maybe show that you're tough, but also, you know, a family person, or, you know, human or humorous or whatever it might be. Here apparently is Lyndon B. Johnson singing with his dog. So when we look at these and we talk about constructing identities, you can go a lot of different directions with this. Ronald Reagan, here he is, you know, hard-working Western man, taming the wilderness with his chainsaw. Kind of what that projects. It makes me think of all the trees he deforested, poor environmental things, but that's my thing. Anyways, here's another image of Ronald Reagan. This was on the cover of Life, obviously. Again, he's wearing this cowboy hat, and, you know, that thing, that object that you use, you know, I'm asking you to take a photograph and take an object and think of the connotation of that object and what it takes in here. And, you know, Reagan very much, you know, loved the West. You know, he was, well, he wasn't from California. I believe he was born in the Midwest, I believe in Iowa. I'd have to look that up. But, you know, moved to Hollywood, was an actor, lived in California, loved California, was governor of California, and then president of the United States. And he exuded this aura of the West, you know, this cowboy hat. And think of all of that entails and how much of that is a cultural construct. You know, yes, cowboys wore hats. You know, keep that sun off of them. But think of how that hat has been used in films, how that hat has been used in photographs, how that hat has been used, you know, to symbolize and represent things. You know, the black hat and the white hat, and, you know, our whole construct of what the West means is really interesting. You know, taming the land, as well as, you know, taking what, you know, manifest destiny. You know, that whole idea, and, you know, it falls in with that hat. So, you know, all these ideas here. Here's an image of Nancy Easter. Obviously, I just thought this was kind of interesting and funny, kind of sweet. I don't know. Getting back to the campaign, here we have Gary Hart, who was 1984. Running against Reagan, as he was the Democrat, or he wasn't the Democrat nominee, he was trying to be the Democrat nominee. He was leading, and here he is, you know, in his office doing his senatorial business, and, you know, the handsome young senator. His campaign was derailed because of this photograph. You know, just him and this lady, and the lady is not his wife. And this all comes out, you know, very publicly. The Miami Herald gets on to this story, and they pursue it, and eventually give a context to this image, which was very unflattering to Gary Hart, because this is not his wife. So thinking about context. Now, if this was his daughter, or if this was his wife, or something like that, just think of how that would change the image. That's the next project we're going to deal with, is context of images, how we can change the meaning of images. And this, you know, context destroyed his chance to become the Democratic presidential nominee. Here we have Michael Dukakis. He ran against Bush, the first Bush, George Bush. And this photograph put him in a very negative light. I'm not quite sure why. I see it. People just thought he looked kind of odd and uncomfortable. He was seen as weak in the military, weak in defense, so he thought he would bolster his image, and he got in this tank, and photographs were taken, and this image was everywhere, and people, just thought he looked kind of funny, and it didn't help his image and didn't help what people thought about him as far as defense. Hurt him quite a bit, apparently. Getting to more contemporary images, here we have John McCain, the last presidential election, and just one of many images. Nothing very significant about this image. I just kind of pulled it off. There's so many. So here's McCain. The interesting I remember from that election was the story about Sarah Palin, his running mate, and how people they found out that she was getting really nice clothes, designer clothes, glasses, really expensive things to help her run, and people made a really big deal out of it. And of all the things I thought should have been made a big deal of, that was not my concern. But it just I think underscores to me how little people generally actually think about the visuals of a campaign. They just look at it and they react to it. There's another scene in that video, hopefully I'll get that posted, that you can watch, that talks about, they have Ronald Reagan's PR guy, and they're talking about it, and he says that people take impressions of images more than the objective context of what's being said or what's being shown. They take impressions of these things, and that helps make their decisions. To me, it absolutely makes sense that people are going to give her money to dress well and look good. I don't know if I have a problem with that. I probably don't. But it was made of quite a big deal in that last election. And I just wonder, how much do people really understand how much is trying to be visually communicated to them? I think this is our job as educators, is to help people understand that. And that's why I think visual culture is so important, that we understand that. We understand the construct of these characters who we put up as candidates. Here's a portrait of Barack Obama. And, I don't know, nothing very monumental about it, but he looks kind of strong, looks kind of pissed. He's off to the right, decentered, very strong lighting, kind of thoughtful. So, what do these images convey? What do they say? And I love this image. I think when I saw this image, what a powerful image. What a great use of environment. He looks like he's a man doing. He's man on a mission. He's man going up there to do something. And I think this is a very powerful photograph. This is of Barack Obama when he was first going to Senate. And I thought it was just a brilliant photograph that communicates a lot. It's beautiful, too. It's gorgeous image. All right, so there are some images and some thoughts on those. Hopefully that'll help you.